Welcome everyone to Coffee with Charli. This is a series presented by Figma and hosted by me, Charli Marie, where I get to sit down with the designers behind the systems at lots of different types of companies, on many types of teams. We take a look inside their Figma files and behind the scenes of their design system to learn how it was created, what problems it's solving, what challenges they're facing with it. And today I am joined by two designers from the Shopify team. We've got Sara Hill and Dan Ross, who are both senior product designers there on the design systems and core experience team, to take us through Shopify's design system and the challenges they're currently facing with scaling it as the product and the company scales as well. Let's get into it. Welcome, Sara and Dan, to Coffee with Charli. I'm excited to have, this is the first duo interview that we've done for Coffee with Charli. So this is going to be fun. It's going to be great to learn more about Shopify's design system. Should we start with an introduction? How did it come about? What's it called? Give us the lay of the land.
So at Shopify, we use Polaris. That's the design system that we use that is catered for admin. It's a place where we house our common practices, principles, and beliefs centered around content, design, and components and experiences created for Shopify's admin. So before Polaris, there are a couple of people who are focused on building patterns and components, but components and experiences at Shopify they didn't feel like they came from the same place. They felt different from each other. We had components in GitHub. They were consolidated into a sketch UI kit at some point, and many of us modified that UI kit for our own team needs. We had a style guide as well, which was our source of truth. But what we didn't really have was like a unification of our experiences, and we weren't having collaboration between people and teams. So a small team was created with that mission in mind and to unify our experiences. They collaborated with teams and individuals throughout the company, and Polaris was created, and I think that was in about 2017. And it was adopted through the organization. There's a really good article about this named "The System Always Kicks Back" by Kyle P.
So 2017, you said, that's getting on a while ago now. How's things gone since then? How has the design system evolved? What challenges are you facing with it now in 2021?
Yeah, good question. Right now, Polaris acts as our base foundational system with primitive components. So we have many systems at Shopify, for example, billing, channels, checkout, retail, and some of these systems use Polaris for admin as a base for their own components. All right, here's a screen in admin. So this is our homepage that, I mean, everyone I think knows that has used Shopify. And so like throughout the admin, we have, again, lots of different uses for cards, which have to stay pretty flexible. We have some parts of our admin which may not be as reusable as many of our components. So for example, this sidebar over here. Yep. And like many of our index pages are made out of, so these top level pages are made out of these resource list components. And so like none of these resource lists, for example, function the same way. So that's again, like another point to like keeping this flexible, making sure that people have just what they need to explore these experiences that they're making.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And is there a certain part of this that we can go to show people like where the system needed to be expanded, where you were feeling the squeeze of the old system that wasn't perhaps scaling or wasn't at foundational levels?
I think a good example, Dan, is talking about Polaris for retail, because they have a really tangible use case where their audience and their environment and their devices are very different. They're standing in front of buyers. So a lot of the factors or the pressures that they face on the job are very different, which inherently changes the way Polaris for retail had to think about that system. They have to work really quickly. They have to really prioritize the buyer in that experience, because if one thing goes wrong, they're going to lose that customer. So their business relies on that. So they had to prioritize speed and efficiency over some other things in the system. They're also primarily working on tablets, so handheld devices. They might be at arm's length. So that affects the size, the type scale, the spacing, the touch targets need to be really big so they can move quickly through the screens. And you can see, like, if you're comparing that to admin, where its density is a lot tighter, you're typically going to be working in your home office or a back office, which might be a back room in your physical store. You're going to be at your desktop computer. So you're going to have a lot more real estate. So the density can be smaller. And so that's another way where the experiences differ. Also, the lighting conditions. When you're in a retail store, the lighting conditions can be vastly different. I know there's a designer on the retail team that always tells a story about this knife shop. When you walk in, it almost looks like a museum. The lights gleam off the knives, and it's pretty dark, so that they illuminate those their products. But as a result, it can be pretty dark. It can be harder to read the screen. So they had to think about that and how it affects the UI and how it affects them moving through the experience. Which also, POS is largely a dark mode experience. They're also building in a light mode, but it was thought about from dark mode from the beginning, because that's really what is going to create a better experience in those retail environments.
Yeah, that's a super interesting example, and totally makes sense why the, light mode, high information density, admin screen components weren't working for the retail point of sale situation. What does happen next? Sarah, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So as Dan mentioned, we have a lot of local systems that are starting to crop up, and they power these various experiences, like Dan mentioned, billing, channels, checkouts. And he also talked a little bit about consistency. That was kind of the main impetus for Polaris when it started. It was born out of the admin, so it made a lot of sense at the time, the approach we took. But now we're finding, because it is so specific to one product experience, it's not scaling in the way that we need it to. It's very rigid. Teams are not able to prototype quickly because the decisions behind those components, they're not scaling to different experiences. It's very specific to solving merchant problems around running their business, where experiences can be very contextual to different users, different audiences, different devices, and environments. So one thing we started to do is reframe Polaris around experiences. And experiences are really made up of context, which is how users do their job, journeys, the steps that a user takes in their jobs, and factors, so the different pressures that they face on their job. And by doing this, it basically sets all of these teams up to really have a strong understanding of their users' context, so that when they are building components and they're down in the weeds of the UI, they're actually thinking about it from the perspective of the user's world and how it solves that problem.
Right, rather than just sort of shoehorning what was designed for one experience into all the experiences, it's sort of customizing a little bit as needed.
Back in late last year, we released Alpha Polaris, which basically is the next Polaris. So this is really, again, starting to elevate experiences. If we look at an experience here, we can see different factors that we're starting to surface to basically help teams identify partners that they can work with. So these are common factors that are shared across these experiences. And that helps us as the Polaris team also identify areas of overlap. And to make this a little bit more tangible, if we're looking at pieces of the UI, like a banner might be a good example. One thing that we're doing now is we're starting to look at these pieces and abstract what a foundational piece would be, so that we can really think about how can teams use this and solve for their users' context. So what are the shared pieces across these banners? What makes a foundational piece? How can that translate to code and other tools like Figma? So we'll think about, how can this translate to our UI kit? because we're finding now there are a lot of different UI kits that are cropping up, and they're having to recreate, whether it's in code or design, they're having to recreate these common UI elements. And we want to take out that work. And so this is how we're starting to do that.
Yeah, can you give us an example of some of these decisions of how to break these banners down to the foundational level? Talk us through a bit of that.
Yeah, for sure. So this is work we're actively doing right now. So one example here is if we look at these banners, we can start to see that some commonalities are they all have an icon. They all have a title, some action of sorts. Some of them have a dismiss, some of them don't. So it's really about pulling those key decisions out. We've also recently had discussions about how we use banners in a thoughtful way for at the notification level. Like we kind of have this banner blindness happening in the admin. So that's also a discussion that's happening here of, okay, we have a default or informational banner. Do we want to think a little bit more thoughtfully about maybe we don't provide other types of variants of banners at the foundational level, but we let you decide at the experience level if that's the right path for you. So really trying to, by creating these foundational pieces, we're also trying to enable meaningful variation in them. So we've got a set of sensible defaults, but then how do we tie that to the meaningful variation of really solving a specific problem in your experience for your user?
I like that term, meaningful variation, as well. It sort of implies that you're not just like making a change because you feel like it. There's got to be a reason behind it, and it's got to have meaning for the experience that you're creating for. I like that. That's great. Should we jump into seeing how this works in Figma then?
Yeah. So at Shopify, we aim to create prototypes pretty quickly. We like to prototype fast and early in all of our projects. So we put more time into creating our components so that people have less hierarchy, layer structure, and just like a lot less to deal with within Figma. So because of variance in auto layout, we've also managed to decrease the amount of time and knowledge that somebody needs when they jump into Figma to be able to create a prototype and iterate a little more quickly. So I'll go in and show you how we might build a screen. The first thing we might do is search for components in our UI kit, just like any other. So I'll go in, I'll add a top bar. I'll move this. So I'll add a top bar, and I'll say that's for small screen, bring it down to the minimum size and just throw it in there. I'll add a page component because that's what we always put at the top of any layout at Shopify. So just bring that in as well.
Nice.
And I'll say that I'm designing a customer screen, and every kind of layout at Shopify usually includes cards, so we'll just add some cards in there as well. And so like pretty quickly our designers and developers and researchers can come in and use any of these variants or anything as well to kind of increase the complexity of their layout. So I might add a title, some footer actions, some header actions, and a couple of sections. And that can help us quickly make these prototypes.
Yeah, that's like super slick, super easy, and seems like a great use of variants and auto layout as well. Tell me a bit more about the process of setting that up. How big a job was that?
Yeah, there was a lot of testing, especially like putting it in people's hands in the wild and seeing how they play with things. So one example of that is so this navigation bar. At the time, variants were kind of new and untested. I think they're still pretty new, but they were kind of untested and there were no best practices. So like if you wanted to change something like the state of this navigation bar, how would you do that? Do you put everything behind a drop-down menu or something like that? There are pros and cons to that. For example, not being able to see all the options quickly and not being able to maybe understand what that does until you open it. So something we did with a lot of components was like create a structure like this where we had a bunch of switches and you could just quickly change the state of that bar just by turning on these variants. And this whole navigation bar has auto layout implemented on it as well. So if I wanted to add more navigation items, I could quickly do so as well.
Nice. Because something you mentioned to me as well is that you're building for builders, and that there's a bunch of different experience levels of people who are using these components that you've built. So I guess the testing was a big part of that, right? To put it in their hands and see just how easy it was to speed things up for them.
Yeah. I think we really had to consider all the different levels of education, because we have many designers who are, quite senior designers, but maybe they're not Figma experts. And we have a lot of junior designers who conversely might be pretty great at Figma, but still learning design as a craft as a whole.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different types of people to consider when we work with all of this. And one of the things we tried to do was keep this system flexible and bendable, so that you could create any of the experiences that you needed to create. So for example, some of our components have auto layout applied to them because they don't change very often. So for example, this is our banner. We might decide that it's a success banner or maybe a critical banner. It has a primary and secondary footer action. It's not dismissible. And when I type into it, I can just type any sort of text and it grows as well. So that's handy because these banners don't really change. But then when it comes to cards, which are our they need to be our most flexible component because we use them everywhere. It's not as easy to give people all of those great auto layout features, because again, we'll talk about different education levels. It's easier to apply auto layout later when you understand it than to retroactively remove it if you've never used it before.
Right.
So for example, if I go into our card and I start typing things in, it doesn't expand.
Okay.
And that's because it needs to stay flexible in case you want to put anything in it anywhere. And so here's a version where I, in about a minute, just change this to adapt to auto layout. And it seems great, but then when I don't know, let's say I had an image that I wanted to throw inside of that card. If I did that and I wanted to align it to the right-hand side of the card, it's not really possible. So there's that balance of like really giving people what they need and to explore and use Figma as a playground versus giving them a bunch of components which don't really act as building blocks and allow them to really extend their system.
It's like you've seen where automation and auto layout and the setup and all of that can go too far, right? In that where it can actually become a hindrance if you go too far with it, and it stops you from being as flexible as you need. So you've gone right up to the point and then stopped, which is great.
Yeah, and that came from a lot of testing. Definitely didn't know that out of the box. So many components were built and rebuilt a few times just to understand that.
And how has the system been scaling for you then, since we're in alpha Polaris right now? Is that correct? Is what we're calling it, this next iteration?
Yeah, it's an interesting time because we're still very much like growing into that. I think also what Dan showed with the card and just having so much flexibility built into that. I think again that's a good example of like something that needs to be abstracted into foundational components. And then we have very specific uses for it in Polaris for admin. And at that level, it kind of depends on like what level you're at. So the Polaris for admin team needs to build a design system to power all of the various experiences that enable merchants to run their business. So like a fulfillment card is a very specific component that I can see in the future world of alpha Polaris, like Polaris for admin takes that foundational card, creates the fulfillment card. And then if I work on the fulfillment team, I can just take that card. I don't have to worry too much about the overuse of flexibility. I can just take that. Whereas if I'm building something new, I can then take that foundational piece and I have a lot more range of flexibility within that. So I can build from the ground. So I think we're still kind of defining those levels as well.
Yeah. And that's the thing, right? Design systems are a living, maybe not perhaps breathing organism that keeps evolving over time. We showed a lot of stuff. I think we showed a lot of good things. Cool. Thank you so much, Dan and Sarah, for sharing all this with us. Super interesting problems that you're solving with this. And no doubt, like, as soon as you solve these challenges, new ones will come up. And like, maybe we'll get to hear about those ones in the future. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Hope you enjoyed today's episode. It was really interesting for me to hear about how Shopify is solving these scaling issues and the smart ways they've used their system with variants in particular in Figma to make it really fast for building new screens. If you want to see more episodes of Coffee with Charli, then check them out on the Figma YouTube channel. There's been a bunch of different types of companies and different like levels and stages of design systems covered. And there's more to come as well, so make sure you subscribe so that you see those when they get published. And if you want to find me elsewhere, you can find me on my own YouTube channel, Charli Marie TV, where I also make a lot of videos about design. All right, we'll see you in the next one, everyone. Bye.